So here's the question. Do you have your Bibles? If you got them on these guys, it's fine. That's okay. That's okay. But just keep all the shopping at bay, please. That's for a different time. But we're going to get into the Word of God here. And that was beautiful if it were not for grace. And thank you for dealing with the battery issues. That was in the middle of the song, You Go Girl. That was great. And thank you, Fabio, for jumping into that and making sure that it could continue. And so now, in the book of Matthew, chapter 19, something very interesting happens. And it all has to do, in many ways, with entitlement. So this guy comes, and I'm not going to read this part yet, but this guy comes to Jesus, and he was a rich young ruler. He comes and says, how can I follow? How can I be a disciple? And Jesus says, how can I follow? Well, you can keep all the commandments. You know them, right? And it was different, though, because Jesus had chosen his 12. Jesus chose them. Isn't it interesting? They didn't choose him. Jesus chose them. But this guy wanted to choose. And I wonder who that rich young ruler was. I really am wondering. Sometimes I have theorized, and I've heard this theory, but just on the offside, that it might be Eleazar. Lazarus? In Greek, Lazarus. Might have been the guy. Who knows? He was a good friend of Jesus. He was someone that cared, but he was not one of the 12. There were others, I'm sure, that we could figure out. Might even have been maybe Nicodemus, Joseph of Arimathea, ones that we know, or maybe someone we have no idea, which I'm sure there are thousands of people that connected with Jesus that we know nothing about. So, this guy comes and says, I've kept all these commands since I was a child. And Jesus looked at him, and actually, I think in the book of Luke, he says, and loved him. And then he said, this one thing you lack. Sell everything you got, give it to the poor. He never asked Peter to do this. He never asked Matthew to do this. But he said it to this guy, this rich young ruler. That hits him. His face drops. He had been there his whole life. And yet, there he is. And then Peter says an amazing thing later on. Verse 23, this is before he says anything. He says, truly, he says to his disciples, truly I tell you, it is hard for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of heaven. Again, I tell you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of the needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God. Then the disciples heard this, and they were greatly astonished and said, who then can be saved, is the question. That's a very smart question. Who can be saved? If we got something, how's it? Only the poor people? And Jesus does something amazing. He just reverses everything. He just built up a case that was like a social justice case, right? It seems, in the modern sense, trying to judge him by modern principles, we're building up something, and all of a sudden then Jesus does a twist and says, with man it is not possible, but with God, boom, all things are possible. Isn't it interesting how God looks at things? Totally different than politics and ideologies, but he's dealing with the heart, which is so much harder to deal with than all the rules and regs that we're given in society. Dealing with the heart. You can try to change someone's heart through laws and rules and regulations. You can try to legislate how people drive, but does that really stop speeding? No, it only stops speeding as long as the cop is sitting there. You ever had that? You know, you got on your phone, your app, and all of a sudden you get a little, oh, there's a police, and everybody on the road just slows down. In fact, sometimes even slower than what the speed limit says, because they forgot what the speed limit was. They wouldn't get caught, right? Welcome to humanity. Rules do not change the heart. And we will see this now when we look at how fair God really is. Because in the big scheme of things, He's not fair in the way we want Him to be. He is just and fair at the same time. The message for today is, God, it's not fair. So now, there's one thing that then Peter says. This guy is a businessman. And he says, Peter answered him in verse 27, "Look, we've left everything to follow you. What then will be for us?" Now the twist. Now it's like, oh, so that guy didn't leave everything, but we did. Jesus, of course, then has a statement that he does and says, many people will receive more and more, but then the first shall be last and the last shall be first. Again, Jesus twists it again. Did you notice that? The minute you think you've nailed what Jesus is saying down, he then twists it again. The first shall be last and last shall be first. And then he comes to chapter 20. And I'd like you to turn now to chapter 20 with me. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner. Is like someone that owns, in other words, he owns a business, right? He went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarii. Okay, I have 2 denarii here on this table, and I'll show them to you in a second. But have you ever been to Home Depot before in the morning? There's actually the area, now they actually section it off as the day workers area. If you go to Home Depot, you can go and buy roofing materials, and then you can, contract the guy that's going to do it. Now, I don't know how the work will get done, whether it'll be good or not, but it'll work. Or maybe you need a handyman. You go to Home Depot, or someplace like that. I'm sorry, I'm not advertising for Home Depot, I promise you. But the day workers, and this is how the ancient world works. This is how it worked. Same thing in Jesus' day. You go to city center, whatever, town center, and you go at 6 in the morning, because 6 is when the sun is up. I mean, almost up. In an agrarian culture, in a culture where you're working the land, you work from sun up to sundown. And when the sun goes down, you really have to go to bed, because unless you can afford to go to a place that can burn the fire all night long doing whatever. Now, in modern world, we have electricity, okay? They had it back then, but they just didn't know how to harness it. We have electricity with bulbs and light bulbs, and so now people can be really late at night doing stuff. In fact, sometimes people are late at night on these things or on the computers. Please, sometimes it's good to shut them off, get some sleep, right? And we wonder why we're tired in the morning. Well, in the ancient world, when the sun went down, unless you had money to burn stuff, you go to sleep. I mean, that's just how it is. I remember when I was, it was maybe about 7 years ago. Mom, you remember we went to the tent out there near Beersheba, the Abraham's tent, but it was not Abraham's tent. It was this place where we actually stayed and slept on rugs in the desert. And that was a part of, and people could get their own little place if they wanted to. They could, have a place. But really, it was an experience when we had once an Israel trip. And, I woke up at 3 in the morning. And then I understood that the reason why the patriarchs got up at 3 in the morning had nothing to do with their holiness. It had to do with their back. We're all awake, right? So, yeah, you get up, like this, and God says to Abraham, look up. See the stars? Your children will be like that. There it is. I can't see the stars. Okay, then look down. It's Jewish humor, right? Okay, then look down. You see the sand? That's how your descendants are going to be. So the same thing is what I saw. And I said to my dad, maybe our descendants will be like that. Look up in the sky. I can't see them. Never mind. I see it down here. 3 a.m, and my back hurts, and that's what makes me holy. Up early. Well, in the ancient world, you have to get up before the sun. You have to go out and work the field because you can't work at night. And you go to city center and you hire the guys that are going to help you out. And he went and he hired this crew, this day crew, that would come and help him, work the vineyard to get the grapes. Because you got to do it soon. Because when those grapes are ready, you want them done. You get them, you crush them, you make the juice, whatever you're going to do, because those things will spoil. The animals will get to them. When they're good, you got to get them off the vine. The clock is ticking. So he goes out there, and early in the morning, at 6 a.m, he got his first crew, and they started coming. And he agreed to pay them a what? Oh, as I promised before, I have 2 denarii here. Now this denarii here is actually a Greek denarii. He has Alexander the Great's head. You see there's a horn on the side of his head. You see that? You find that in Alexandria, or in Greece you'll find that with Alexander the Great. And of course there's I believe it's Athena sitting on her throne, at the back, the denarii. That is Greek denarii. Notice it's pretty big compared to this one. This is a Roman denarii. Okay, this one has Emperor, I believe it's Tiberius on it. It's harder to see this one, not as clean. It's more tarnished. You'll notice it's smaller, by the way. See how smaller it is? You know how you ever heard of inflation? You know how the Fed's printing money? Well, they did the same thing back in Roman times. You know why this is smaller? It's because if you have a lot of money and you're in government, no one will get after you, you can cut the money, shave the edges of it off, and make more coins. Inflation. They did the same thing back then that they're doing today. It's always the rich guys that benefit from inflation, not us, generally speaking. And so this is why you see it a little smaller in the Roman. And you'll notice that it actually, you wonder why the face is cut off a little bit. Well, that's the shaving. As a empire begins to degrade, that's what happens. Everyone's out for themselves, right? And but here's another piece that's a very interesting piece. This was supposed to be worth a day's wages. It seems pretty small, doesn't it? But if you hold it, it's kind of heavy. It's silver. It's kind of heavy. It's better than today. You know what we give people is we'll give them a $100 bill or maybe $150 for work. Now, I know with inflation, it used to be I could preach a sermon and say $100 is like a denarii, day's work, but now I can't say that anymore. It's actually near 200 now. You know how inflation is going. When you buy eggs, it's much more expensive, so the prices go up, and therefore the denarii was worth, back then, a day's wages. So you take it home, and you get to actually now have that money to spend for yourself. Every one of the workers was promised this amount of money. So let's say it's $200 today. Let's just off the top of the head say, everyone was promised $200. If you work for me for the day, at the end of the day, I'll give you $200. 6 in the morning, that's a good deal. Let me do it. So are you with me on this story? I haven't put you to sleep yet. All the economics and all this kind of thing. So, okay. And by the way, I'm going to talk for a second near the end about inflation and how we sometimes, our entitlement feels like We like inflation when we have. But let's not get ahead of myself. So then about 9 o'clock, verse 3, about 9 in the morning, he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace, doing nothing. He told them, hey, you also come to the vineyard. I'll pay you whatever, what? He didn't promise them a denarii. He just said, I'll pay you what's right. And the guys say, you know what, I don't have a job right now. It's 9. I mean, half the day's already gone. Have you ever done construction? Half the day by 9 to 10 starts disappearing. I mean, watch out when the guys show up at 10 to 11 o'clock in the afternoon. You're not going to get nothing done because lunchtime takes out another 2 hours, right? That's just how it is, generally speaking. And forget it. By 2 in the afternoon, no one's going to work on nothing. They're just going to open it up and say, I got to leave. I'll be back tomorrow. Mañana, right? And that's so 9, they want the money. They need it. Whatever it is, I'll take it. So let's keep reading here. See, the reason why I have this long explanation is I have to let you understand. Sometimes we don't get the culture in which this is written. But it exists today. It's just a little different. Things are the same. They're different. They're the same. And so try to figure out which way. Anyway, say, good one, Pastor John. You said they're different, but they're the same. Whatever. All right. So then, verse 3. No. Yes, 5. So they went out again about noon. And then at 3 in the afternoon. And did the exact same thing. Now, your Bible may say the first hour, the third hour, the 6th hour, because in ancient renderings, the day began at 6, the first hour. Then the 6th hour is 12 noon, and then the 9th hour is 3, and then finally the 12th begins the next set. The first hour, 6 p.m., which basically sets up the evening, and you have the count during the night that happens. So they rendered it a little different than us, but it's the same, but different way. They went by the sun in the sky rather than by clocks on the wall that we have today. So essentially, we'll give you something. And if I was hired at 5 in the afternoon, 1 hour before work is generally done, I'm not expecting much. But you know what? Here, let's read here. So about 5 in the afternoon, he went out and found still others standing around. Wow, those guys are standing around. I'd say by about 12 o'clock to 1 o'clock, you're not going to get a job. But the guys who are there at 5, either they really are bad workers or they're really good workers that haven't been able to find someone. You don't have anyone in the middle, right? The bad workers are the ones that are just laying there sleeping. The good workers are the ones like, man, I need a job, and I need it now. I got to feed somebody. I got to eat myself. I got to have some job. He catches him and says, why are you standing here? And the guys said to him, we've been, because no one has hired us, they said. He said to them, you also go and work in my vineyard. Verse 8. When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, call out the workers to pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired. You remember what Peter said earlier? We've forsaken everything for you, Lord. What about us? What are we going to get? Jesus says, you're going to get a lot. You're going to get way more than even some kind of payment. But the first shall be last, and the last shall be first. I work with a lot of guys working on churches, on our church, or at Sunland Tahunga, Livingstone's or Sunland Tahunga on churches. And I always can tell the time when it's pay time. Because, you get a big wad of cash in the pocket and you go walk with this worker over quietly, pay that worker, and then you go to the next worker and you pay them. And Usually you don't do it right in front of everyone. But interestingly enough, he said to the foreman, in this parable, the vineyard owner says, line them up and pay the ones that came last first. He comes, the vineyard owner, the foreman starts handing out the denarii, and the denarii look more like this one, with the face of Caesar on it. These are from the museum, by the way, and one of them I got in Greece when we were there, and this one we got in Israel. And so he takes the denarii and he gives one to the very first guy. He's only been there 1 hour. If you have been there since 6 o'clock, would you start calculating? Be honest with me. Come on now. Come on now. I remember, I learned this when I'd been a pastor for a long time, but it wasn't until I got to Temple City Church that I dealt with more finances. Oftentimes, outside of California, a lot of pastors used to say, treasurer will take care of it. That's just how it generally works. But in California, people are so busy, it's like, pastor, you got to deal with this. And plus, when you got a lot of people, there's a lot of arguments that can happen over money. So you have to, be involved because you never know what's going to happen. And that's where I started learning, I need to go talk to the individuals about how much, we would have students, a graduation is coming up, right? And we would get an amount of money just to help us take care of the place, to clean it up and make sure it's okay. And it wasn't much. So I learned I had to talk to the individuals beforehand and say, for this job, you're going to get this amount. We'll work out the details of how that works, but it'll be this amount. Because I had learned that whenever you did the normal pay thing, they look and they say, wait a minute, the government took out this, you said it was going to be this much, but I only got this much. And they're young people, they're not used to having their salary just, tax. Uncle Sam, man, he takes a lot more than Jesus does, let me tell you. And he does a lot less with it than Jesus does. But anyway, it's just, have you seen that? Have you looked at you sometimes and you see and you go, oh, wow, well, what is F-I-C-A? What is that? And I go, okay, next time what we're going to do is we're just going to deal with a job and we'll make sure the amount matches. Whatever it is, we'll make sure that the amount matches what the job is. That way you don't have to argue about it. Well, this is the hard part of these guys. These guys that first came, last came, they get a denarii. Woohoo! 1 hour. Now, by the way, I want you to know that sometimes they get a bad rap, okay? The late guys sometimes get a bad rap, but maybe, when someone's, I don't know, have you ever worked on a job that's hard and in the heat of the day? At about 6 hours, it starts becoming almost its non-work, unless the person is really strong and good. It gets longer, and it gets tiring. But the guys who come in immediately, man, they can do a lot at the end. Maybe as much as sometimes the first 2 hours to 3 hours in the beginning. It depends on the individual. So instead of judging it by fairness in that way, instead look at it as how God sees us. Because remember, this parable was not meant to come up with labor policy any more than a lost sheep, of which I sometimes am. I'm not a sheep. I'm a human, okay? It's a parable. But still at the same time, we have to understand that Jesus sees our value differently than the world does. He gives us a denarii. By the way, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist. We as an Adventist church came about in the 1800s. And we like to say that we are like a crust above everyone else sometimes. We say, oh, yeah, ooh. But actually, we're latecomers. You know, the hard times were early Christianity. Building a church that's a denomination is hard, but it's nothing in comparison to building from full-on paganism. The Apostle Paul and Peter and the kind of things they went through to make the church happen. I mean, I know it's the Spirit of God that worked in people. And I know, we have all these guys like Priscilla and Aquila. And we have, these husband-wife teams. We have these rich widows who had their husbands who had died, and they donated to the work of God and had the people of Christianity grow through these difficult places like Corinth. I'm doing my call to prayer now on Corinthians, man. It's hard in Corinth. It's hard in Rome. It's hard in Galatia to go flat out of nowhere. They're like the ones who begin in the early day. It may be easier in one way, but it's super hard in the other. But we Seventh-day Adventists show up at about 1 hour before the end, right? Right? So when you think about it, I want you to think of it that way. Because when we're the ones that aren't as awesome as we think we are, and we realize that, perhaps our view of fairness changes. Because I understand. There were Seventh-day Adventists in the beginning of our church that worked their fingers to the bone. James White died an early death because of all the work he did for the work of God. The cold days, the long moves, the work day and night printing. And then we're here with computers, and we barely can show up on time, right? Welcome to sometimes the workers that come an hour before the end. But here's the denarii. Did you hear me? So the denarii starts getting handed out now to the ones who came about 3 in the afternoon. Denarii. And the guys at 3, they started calculating. They're like, wait a minute. But they're not going to say much. But there is one crew that had a lot to say. And here we are. I lost my place. There it is. So, he went, he said to the foreman, the last ones for first. The workers who were hired about 5 in the afternoon came and received a denarii, about $200, for their 1 hour. Wow, talk about minimum wage, man. Woo! Forget $20 an hour. I'll take $200. Verse 10. So when those who came were hired first, they expected to receive what? Oh, they expected about $1,000. Forget that, man. If you're going to calculate, let's calculate for real. Let's have it on the percentage of the day, man. We're all good at that. I don't care how bad at math you are. When it comes to that, we're going to be good. We're going to work it out. Each of them also received a denarii. When they received it, they began to what? What? Grumble. Now remember, in the beginning, Jesus says you're going to get a denarii. And that was fine. And then we saw that other guy over there that only worked for an hour. In fact, let me add another little caveat to it that Jesus adds. They began to grumble against the landowner. These who were hired last worked only 1 hour. They said, and you have made them what? Equal to us. We all love equality until someone else is equal with us as human beings. We have borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day. And you know what? They're right. Have you ever harvested anything? When I was a kid, I used to work at Grandma and Grandpa's farm in Virginia. Grandma my slave driver grandma, would send us out, Oliver, James, and I, and we had to do blackberries. Have you ever harvested blackberries? There's thorns on those things. All day. Now, of course, the nice thing about blackberries, and you would always see the evidence of it on our faces, because you could see, she could find out how much of it we ate. But we had buckets. We're filling buckets. Or we were digging out potatoes. Oh, I hate potatoes. Potatoes are good to taste, but have you ever had to tend to those things? And then you pull them out one at a time, or planting is even worse. And Virginia is not forgiving when it comes to the sun and the humidity. Literally, you need scuba gear some days in the summer to breathe. So much water in the air. We have that here in California right now. We have a lot of humidity, more than we've had in the past. It's actually, I believe that our systems are moving from the south to the north. It's feeling more like Guadalajara right now. But the thing is the humidity. You can breathe, you can feel, you can smell the water in the air. If you're used to that, if you grew up in a place where you understand humidity. In Thailand, I needed gills to live in that place. Loved it, but I needed gills to live there. Sorry, like a fish. Be able to breathe anyway, never mind. But the thing is it's the heat of the day. And boy, when that sun and humid, it hits right about here. I'm glad at those days I did not have the bald spot I have today. At a certain point, you don't want to move anymore. No more digging up the potatoes. And you dig it up, and of course you hit it wrong, and you cut a potato right in half. You're not supposed to do that. You got to get around it, nice and around. But those things grow out, and these big old things. But they're, you're working, and you get those bugs, and you get them off, and there's mosquitoes, and there's all kinds of flying things that are biting you from every direction, especially right here. You ever heard of redneck? That's what Pastor John had when he was a kid doing it. Actually, he may still have it, but never mind. But the thing is, those guys who were there all day, it was not fun. It wasn't fun at all. And they saw that same denarii going to the one who was there only 1 hour. And they said, "You're not fair." And you know what? They were right. It's not fair that we deserve heaven just like those who have worked so hard in the past for God. All we do is flip around on our phones and do things on cyberspace, and we call that evangelism, compared to the guys who had to go day and night and literally die. Jay and Andrews out there in the middle of England, freezing. There wasn't food at one time. Some of them were literally eating plants. They didn't have money for food, and it wasn't a system like it is today. But working for God. I'm not trying to say that it should be like that. I'm saying, you know what? I am so blessed that Jesus gave the denarii, even if we haven't worked like they did. My friends, when we look at others and we see the blessing that God gives them, can't we just be brothers and sisters when we see that blessing? Instead of looking at others and saying, why are they? Why? And you see this in the book of Psalms. Have you ever read the book of Psalms? Those who do this, but they did this, and they did what was wrong here, and they get it so well, and my life isn't. That's a human feeling. In fact, let me bring it down to brass tacks for a second. I'd like you to turn in John. I'm going to be done very soon. I apologize. A little longer today. Forgive me. Gemma, do you forgive me? All right. She's eating something yummy. All right. I'm glad. Jesus, remember that story where Jesus says, "Do you love me?" to Peter? And Peter, "Yeah, I love you," back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And he says, then Jesus says, "When you were young, You used to clothe yourself. You used to go to places that you wanted to go, but when you're old, one day you will be taken to a place that you don't want to go, and you will be raised up. Jesus was talking about Peter and his crucifixion. That would happen on the Vatican Hill in Rome years later, where he was crucified upside down. In the museum, I've got an action figure version of this. The giving of your life for him. And he chose it because he didn't feel worthy to die in the way Jesus did. He came to Rome so that the lambs of Jesus could be tended to. That was what Jesus asked him to do, right? He said, take care of my sheep. And Peter took it serious. For the first time in his life, he took it really serious. Then Jesus says to him, you will be lifted up and stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you to that place where you do not wish to go. This is John chapter 21. Jesus said this to indicate the death by which Peter would glorify God. And then he said to Peter, what? Follow me. Now, even though Peter was to do amazing things, it doesn't change the fact that he's just like you and me. For he looks over at another guy, a guy that wrote this book named John, the Apostle John, Saint John. He looks over at this guy, which of course, always it says the apostle whom Jesus loved, because he didn't want to name himself. John. Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved was following him. So they were walking, and there was John behind him. Verse 21. When Peter saw John, or saw him, he asked, Lord, what about him? You know what he's asking? Will he be crucified? Will he die a death that I have to die? How's that guy going to be? And Jesus says an unbelievable thing. If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me. In today's culture, that is so offensive. You felt that, right? Did you feel that? Did you feel that feeling? But Jesus calls us beyond all of this stuff and all of this, what we receive. He calls us to give our lives to him, and he knows that we will do best with what we've been given. But we must have faith in God to be just in his delivery. Are you in your life like the ones who feel in the beginning, that feel it's unfair? I'm with you. But as I was reading this verse, it made me think with a perspective. You know, Peter may have died on a cross, but you know, being boiled in hot oil probably isn't the greatest thing either. John was. Of course, a miracle happened. And then he was put to the Isle of Patmos, where at the Isle of Patmos, he wrote a book called Revelation. Prophecies were given to him, and they probably weren't the most fun events as he lived on this small, hot, ugly island of Patmos. I'm sorry, there's beautiful things now, but when it's like Alcatraz. And then he was released to Ephesus, where then he wrote the book of John. Did you know that? John was the last book written by John, not Revelation. You can tell the difference in his personality, too. later in life. He died at about 105 years old, John did, tradition says, in Ephesus with Polycarp near him, his disciple, Polycarp. It's like Star Wars with these Padawan, you have your guy with you. You hang out, you transfer your knowledge to the next. That's how it worked. And that's how it should work today. So which one had it easier? Peter had it hard. But actually, Peter's talked about. John is not. He's just, we forget because it's not exciting. Maybe, just maybe, we cannot judge. We are not able to judge, truly judge what true joy of life is. Maybe, just maybe, Jesus loves us all the same. God bless you all.